and I have lived through 2 years of COVID in an airline in India. While I'm at Akasa, my experience of the last 2 years that I have to speak about will be from Indigo, because that's where I was while we were going through the pandemic and, going through the whole leasing story and how the world was unfolding in the last 2 years. So, just to give a quick summary of how it changed and what happened is pretty interesting. So, I think I haven't attended a lot of the sessions for the last 2 days, but I think one of the sort of very important things that happens in a lease agreement that we sign with lessors, and this is exactly a structure where, we lease an aircraft from a lessor, but we actually have a sort of a buying deal of the aircraft from either Airbus or Boeing. And then we transfer that right to the lessor, and then we do a lease with the lessor, right? So what is an important document that we end up signing as airlines is the lease agreement with the lessor. Interestingly, this was also, of course, very new to me when I went into aviation, is that there is no concept of a force majeure clause in these lease agreements. So there is no way you can stop paying just because you're in the middle of a pandemic, right? So somebody would think that if, the government has told you to park your by an order, so there is nothing you can do, why should I be paying for those 2 months of my fleet standing on ground? But there is no out in these contracts, right? And so at the end of the day, what you saw in the world of leasing was that you weren't flying your planes, you weren't earning revenues, and this has nothing to do with just India. This was a worldwide phenomenon where you had parked aircraft, but guess what? You were paying for them. So while you weren't earning revenues, you were paying for all the lease rentals that you had on each of your aircraft. So the larger the fleet, the more the payout, as you would imagine. So what happened, right? So there were some airlines that went bust because they obviously had to, file for bankruptcy at a time like this. If you're not making money, you have a large number of employees that an airline always needs, as you would imagine. And you have to keep afloat paying the fixed costs, which are very, very high in this industry. So what you did see was some airlines going bust, but you also saw some airlines come out looking really good. And obviously, very proudly to say, one of them was Indigo. And I was obviously associated with them. And why do I say that some came out looking very good? Is primarily because of the fact that there was, it was one of the airlines, and why I can speak about them, I'm sure there were others in the world, but why I speak about them is because of my association with them and my work during the pandemic time with them, is the fact that there wasn't a single default in any lease payment. So what happened is that many airlines just stopped paying, right? Because they just couldn't afford it. You run out of cash one day because these are all the payments that you're doing out of your entire savings as an airline, right? So everybody saves cash, and then the cash depletes really fast in an airline business. So what happened was that a lot of the money that was, a lot of the cash reserves that we had, we were able to do it. So I think what was strong and what came out of it is that it's very important to have your fundamentals very strong in an airline, your lease agreement and your fundamental cost structure that you capture in your lease, and the deal that you do with your manufacturers, exactly as I think Namita and Anand were explaining to you all as to how those OEM transactions work and what are critical in them. Those become very important at the time of trouble. Nobody picks up these contracts when the going is good. Contracts only open up when there's trouble, right? That's the phenomenon of life. So if those don't capture these fundamentals, you could live through an issue, and which people did. So how did the leasing world change? Unfortunately, not much has changed. You would imagine that airlines now saying that, listen, in each of my lease, I need to have an out to pay, and the lessor is going to agree to it because of what we've lived through. That's not the case, right? I haven't seen it happening yet. I don't see it happening. I've spent a lot of time in the last week in Singapore, just spending a lot of my time with lessors. So it's very fresh in my mind to have these discussions. But I don't think the world is going to change that easy, because the risk that the lessor is taking is very high, as you would imagine, right? Because they're buying an aircraft, they're paying a huge amount of money for it. So the fact that they're buying it and leasing it to you, there is a big risk involved there. So for them to change that completely just because of the fact that, the world has seen the pandemic and now all of us should think differently, is not going to happen so easily in the leasing world. So that's just a snapshot to give you what was happening, what we lived through the pandemic. And obviously, because we lived through the pandemic, we opened up a lot of the contracts, which otherwise you wouldn't. And then what do we see now? I don't see much of a change in what we used to negotiate earlier to what we are negotiating today. It's pretty much the same structure, other than some things that may be thrown in as asking for deferral of payment in case of a force majeure, or some kind of relief if you're going through a force majeure. So that's the kind of landscape that I'm seeing practically when it comes to the leasing world.
Right. No, of course, I mean, you spoke about fixed costs, you spoke about, lease agreements, fundamentals being strong, and, these contracts only being opened when, they ultimately in times like this, when, there is a feud or a dispute. But, I mean, now we've lived through, 2 years of the pandemic. I mean, we can't just spill, the entire life of this industry in these 2 years, because our transformation overall has been big. And I mean, lessors and lessees ultimately, and the manufacturers being part of the same value chain, they need to move together. And so how do you think this relationship between, this interstate relationship between manufacturers, lessors, and lessees have kind of evolved, or how do you see them evolving in the coming times?
So yeah, interesting. So one of the things that's definitely involved is that we speak a lot more than we've ever spoken, right? Between the three parties that you mentioned. I don't think I've ever spent as much time with OEM manufacturers as I have in the last 2 years. And when I say OEM, I'm talking about the, the engine people, the aircraft, the Boeings, the Airbuses. There has been so much of interaction over the last 2 years on every little topic that you can think of that came as a question, a mark, and what we may have written in our contracts that we have signed years ago. So these are not new contracts, right? So contracts for an aircraft are signed way in advance. I'm sure you've gone through these discussions in the last 2 days, but practically you order an aircraft much in advance than when you get the delivery of an aircraft, right? So for example, at Akasa, we've got 72 Boeing that we ordered, right, in November of last year. Am I going to have 72 aircraft tomorrow? No, I'm not, right? So these are things that go over time. So that relationship is built over years, right? There's a relationship of trust. And we know that we have to do business with each other, right? There are only two people in the world making aircraft. So are you going to go and tell someone that, listen, let me pick up the phone and say that, listen, it's the relationship between us is not sounding that great because you're not giving me relief. I'm going to cancel this order and go to someone else. No, you're not. So the whole mindset of the last 2 years I've seen in dealing with, so it was always a great relationship pre-COVID because, we've always done business on the same side of the table, right? We are all on the same side. There is no two sides in an aircraft deal, right? Because you need the aircraft, you need to lease the aircraft, the lessor needs you, and the manufacturer needs you. So given that we were all on the same page, what I saw during COVID is that everybody stood by each other a huge amount, right? So lessors stepped in to help. They actually, wherever they saw there was, the fundamentals being strong, where they saw that relationships had been built, they did step in. They did give deferrals, even though none of that was there in our contracts, right? So why did that happen? Because this was an unprecedented sort of situation in the world. And what I saw was a lot of positive sort of energy between all three parties, between the manufacturer, between the lessor and the airline, right? So I felt that it was a sort of a mix of three people working to make this whole piece a success. We took deliveries through, I think we were one of the, when I say we, at that point of time, Indigo, I think it was one of the only airlines that went ahead and took 40 deliveries on Zoom and through agents. So it was a very tough year, maybe for the lawyers and the sort of the aircraft financing team and all of us sitting in the airline. But the fact of the matter was that we did it. And we did it only because of the trust and cooperation of all three parties who were involved. Otherwise, it wouldn't have happened.
Thanks, Priya. I mean, that's a wonderful insight of how each party has been successful in helping each other out by, you say, deferrals to make this a success, because ultimately the business needs to continue, the operations need to continue. Might I ask, I mean, what do you think? I mean, what is important for a smooth conclusion of an aircraft lease transaction or a purchase transaction? And I mean, what could be, being in a position of a lessee, I mean, what could be sticking points for a lessee, while considering these documents? Because you say that, these documents I mean, when all is well and good, they're kept aside and, way behind in a closet somewhere, and, closets open when there are feuds. So,
Yeah.
what do you think, as per your perspective, is some sticky points for a lessee that they should, have in mind or bear in mind while concluding these kind of transactions?
Okay, so looking at from a lessee's perspective, which is the airline, so what becomes important? So we're looking at two different contracts here. We're looking at an OEM contract, and then you're looking at a lease contract. From an OEM contract perspective, it's obviously very critical to see what are we signing up to in a very long-term contract. So there's no out of these contracts, right? So what is it that you keep in mind while you're negotiating these is to figure out that this is a marriage that has to work, right? There is no out in it that, oh, tomorrow, sorry, I'm not sort of liking this, I'm going to terminate. No, there isn't any of that option. So every little business or commercial or sort of any point that you put into these contracts is with a frame of mind that this is something that you're tied into, right? So you view the contract with that at the back of your mind, and then you see what are the issues that become important for you as an airline. And let me tell you upfront, there's not much that you can negotiate with any of these OEMs, as much as we try hard and we spend hours. And of course, I think Namita has just lived through it with us at Akasa. But I think the fact of the matter is that there are some fundamentals that we will always be looking at, right? So, for example, excusable delay. What is it that becomes what is it that can be an out for the aircraft manufacturer? Does that impact you? What is it that is something that you may want an out, or you may want a deferral, or you may want an advancement of an aircraft delivery, or at times you need a deferral of an aircraft delivery. How many months in advance you have to give notice? Because at times you may have to do it very close to when your aircraft may already be in the process of being manufactured. So there's some points that you sort of think from. Actually, not some, all of them are driven by what the business needs, right? And how you may be able to delay or advance, or I mean, it may not be a delay or advance, but even the fact that if you take delivery, what are the few principles that need to apply on that particular date, right? So when you're looking at that from a manufacturer's perspective, then you also need to capture that in the lease, because at the end of the day, you are now then leasing this aircraft and paying a rental on these aircraft. So what is it that now I need to change my mindset to? What am I thinking vis-a-vis a lessor? Again, the first thing I would want is a force majeure, but I don't get it. So let's be upfront about it. But the second piece that you would look at is that, okay, I've taken this aircraft, I lease it for a couple of years, right? Leases run from 6 years to 12 years to 15 years to 9 years. It all depends on different airlines and what they decide. But what are you looking at? You're looking at that asset with you for a particular number of years. Now you've got that. You've got to redeliver it at a particular time. And in all of the time that the aircraft is with you, you're going to fly it. You're going to do checks on it. You're going to send them for maintenance checks. And all of this costs money, right? So what do I map when I sit on a lease? What do I map with the business team? I sit and map what is my cost outlay for 9 years. That's what's fundamental. So it's not really legal, but I would think it's more commercial. And being a sort of in-house aviation lawyer, you'd start thinking more business than law, because if you don't have that fundamental, there is no success to any of these agreements. So you actually plot it. You plot on year 6, this will happen. On year 3, this will happen. On year 8, this will happen. So what is your outflow of money overall? One is paying your lease rentals, but there are also other maintenance money that you're paying a lessor. So those are aspects that you'll keep in mind while you're negotiating this lease. And then, of course, when you have to redeliver. So what happens is that after a particular number of years, these aircraft go back to the lessor, and then they remarket this aircraft to some other airline. So your story ends with them, somebody else's story begins, right? So when you're returning it, they are very particular on many conditions that they set forth in the lease itself. Now, it's very easy for me to sign up today and say, yeah, I'm going to do this. And this list is of some, annexures that run into various points. But each one of them has to be thought through, right? Can I actually be doing this? If I agree to a particular, so let's take an example, right? I've put in a certain configuration in my aircraft as Akasa that I want seats that are going to be put like this. So you'll see aircrafts which are 323, 33, 222. You can have any configuration of the way it works for a particular airline or the seat style, right? This is just an example. And then when you return it, the lessor says, no, I don't want this 222, which you all liked as Akasa. The world doesn't like a 222. They usually like a 322, right? So guess what? When you give it back to me, I want it as 322, not as 222. So who's going to pay for it? So these are questions you'll ask yourself at the time that you sign it, though it's only something that will happen 10 years later. But I have to take that cost implication on my self when I'm signing that lease today for a return after, say, 10 years, right? So they're mostly commercially driven, but obviously all of it ultimately is put in a contract. And if that contract doesn't look good, you're not going to get anything when you open up to, see if there is there's a battle to fight on any of those points. So that's how I would view both these contracts.
I think, you're absolutely right, because you highlight two essential requirements, and those are, what do you need to run an airline? I mean, the two key takeaways that you point out are, one is fleet, and of course the other is maintenance. Because ultimately, an aircraft, when a passenger, every one of us flies, it's all about experience. We often than not, have apps now, everything we can, tag and see what kind of an aircraft I'm sitting in, what model is it, what year is it, but more than that, more often than not, the ultimate value to the customer that an airline provides is the experience. And you're absolutely right on that. Neha, you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I was just going to say this. These are like very nuanced things that do not, it wouldn't occur to anybody and everybody. Even if we are lawyers in this sector, you have an experience in house, like you said. You know how to look at things commercially and how to manage them. You have to look at things 10 years hence to be able to factor it, into your leasing. I like to take some of the questions that are coming up from the students, Priya. Can I take a couple of them?
Of course, I'd love that.
So there is one coming from Suman R, and she's asking, very curious about Akasa's sale and leaseback arrangements. If you could be kind enough to share any, thoughts on the sale and leaseback model.
Yeah. So a sale and leaseback model is not something new to Akasa. It's an industry practice that goes across airlines around the world. But so what is a sale and leaseback model? So what you do in a sale and leaseback model, just to get to, I know it's going to sound really sort of very babyish and very fundamental to many people on this call, but so what you typically do is you negotiate so let's take an example that what Akasa may have done, right? So we've negotiated a deal with Boeing to buy a particular number of aircraft. Now, frankly, there are people who just go buy that aircraft and put it on their books. There are many airlines who do that. There are many airlines who go into a sale and lease back. So you can choose to do both. I don't know which way Akasa will go in the long run, but let's say that, there is a sale and lease back. I've seen airlines and I've been in airlines where they've been doing both. You do a sale and lease back and you buy aircraft. You do both models. What is the difference, right? So when I do a transaction with, say, a manufacturer, there are only two in the world, but either of them, I decide to buy the aircraft, I can pay for the aircraft, I negotiate a price, I buy it, I bring the aircraft and it becomes mine, right? Now, what if I don't want to put all the money up front to buy that aircraft, right? So an aircraft is not cheap, as we all know. So I may not want to be out of pocket and send all of this. So a sale and leaseback is some mode of actually, in some sense, financing of the aircraft for an airline. So what you do is that you say, guess what? I may have bought this aircraft, but now I'm going to, take it out of my book of buying this aircraft and give it to a lessor. Who's a lessor? A lessor is basically a financing company in simple English, right? So there are all kinds of lessors, there are all kinds of names out there. If you ever Google it, there'll be those first top 3-4 that will always fall. But it's an interesting thing to read if you ever Google it, right? Who is an lessor? Why do they take this risk of an aircraft? Because these guys are funded leasing aid companies, right? So they are leasing companies who are in the business of doing aviation leasing. You have banks who have arms who do it. You have GE, you have Stanchart, you have, the BBAM, the GoShocks. These names are going to sound sort of like French to you all, but if you ever Google them, they're the names that will always come up. They're heavily funded financing companies who then go and actually pay for this aircraft. So I say, guess what? I'm not paying this X million dollars to the manufacturer. You pay for it. And I will then lease this aircraft from you. So Why would they do it, right? Because they've obviously, get lease rental from us, which will always be a percentage of interest that they make on the money that they put in. But you also see that they have committed to buy an aircraft only when they have a commitment to also lease that aircraft, right? So for them, it's in some sense, there's no risk. They're not just buying the aircraft and marketing it. They can do that. Lots of them do it. But this model really means that I'm buying it and then you've got to lease it from me. So I, as the airline, have now passed my risk of buying to someone else, but I have taken on the liability to pay a lease rental to someone who funded this aircraft on my behalf. That's really what it is. If it answers your questions, I'm very happy to get a follow-up question. But simply put, this is the structure, and this is the structure for every airline.
Absolutely, Priya. Understood. I'm sure it was absolutely clear. We are running absolutely short on time, but we'll take just one more question coming from Akasa. Akasa, you can take your question.
Okay, thank you, Priya. It was really wonderful to have you on this seminar.
My pleasure.
Of course, a typical contentious lawyer, I can't hold myself asking you a very basic question about hell or high water. Now, when pandemic came, we had thought there'll be evolution of law on force majeure in India. It was such a big letdown. We never had any, jurisprudence evolving on force majeure in the typical conditions, which were never foreseen by any of us. Do you really see, because, and in reality, from looking at it from the business perspective, the real thing which has happened is that the lessors have taken haircut, because that's the most pragmatic way of looking at the business. Do you really see that going forward, this could be a lesson where the industry, in fact, the financing and the leasing industry would recognize this typical situation and come out with some mechanism wherein in peculiar circumstances this can be dealt with?
Thank you for the question. And, it's very interesting, Atul, that I have actually been in Singapore for the last 10 days, and we happen to have the air show here during the last week here in Singapore. And I must have met close to 12 different lessors as we speak today in the last 1 week. And this is the one question that I have asked each of them, that, this needs to evolve from what we've learned, right? And that lessors have to see this a bit differently, or, put in a structure, or put in some kind of a safeguard which actually protects airlines, because we've seen airlines go down, right? On just because of a clause like this that exists in the contract. And it's interesting, but I think the entire response that I get, and this is not just India related, I'm talking about China, I'm talking about Indonesia, I'm talking about Singapore. The reaction has been that, guess what? Not many airlines have brought it up. And two, if an airline is going to bring it up, we just won't do business with that airline, because we are living on a very high risk when we do this transaction, or when we buy these aircraft on our book to, lease them to airlines. So the immediate reaction is that, no, we're not going to see a change in this clause. And guess what? We are not going to ever change this clause. And though we may have lived through the pandemic, we were very good. We gave people a chance to defer. We gave people a holiday for a couple of months. So, and guess what? There were some airlines who didn't pay, and we know some of them exist even in our country, and nobody came to repossess an aircraft. So my question to them was that you didn't enforce a particular clause that you all fight so much upon. And they said that, we may not, it's all depends on, can we remarket the aircraft, right? So I may pick up the aircraft from you today because I want to enforce this clause, but can I remarket it? So we can't. So in some sense, that clause may exist, but we didn't enforce the clause. And that's how life is going to continue, right? So they're very happy to have a conversation with you if you ever need their help, or if you ever need to come and have a conversation to defer, or a conversation to give them a break or a holiday. But they're not going to look, nobody out of these 11 or 12, the top 10 who we will anyway do business with, are looking at any involvement in this clause. So for me also, it was, as a lawyer, a question that I raised to each one, because it's something I've lived through, right? So, and very, like you put it, you would think that something like this would evolve just from our learnings from the pandemic. But unfortunately, I don't see it change immediately. Though, let me tell you, I'm going to fight for it in each of my leases going forward. I don't know if you're going to get it. But the point is, it's definitely going to be brought up. And let's hope at some point, like you said, it doesn't have to go away, but there has to be something built to give the comfort to both parties, is my feeling too, also after COVID. But as of now, I don't see a change in the market at all as a business person.
One more question,
Yes.
which is also a very pragmatic question. I'm sorry, Neha, I'm taking a little more time than I had committed. You see, in the context of operating an airline in India, I mean, for a foreign airline, it's fine. They fly in, fly out. They don't have just 2 flights a day. And that's the end of the matter. But then there is such a close interface between the infrastructure, the airport infrastructure and the airline. Particularly, you're going to, at some point in time, you'll have 40 flights, 50 flights a day, 60 flights a day. And I'm sure you will achieve it. One thing which has actually impacted the seamless working of the industry has been the conflict between the airlines and the airports. And now ERA has become more of an instrument of creating disputes rather than resolving disputes. You know, prior to that, you would just have an agreement with the airport and negotiate it on a commercial basis and, you know, take the facility. And I'm even surprised because unfortunately, many a times we, at least our firm as lawyers, have been conflicted in 2 kinds of situations. You know, kind of we are representing an airline on the one side and then an airport operator on the other. And then you realize that the whole stakeholder conflict has assumed such a contentious, character. Do you believe that once you come into being, you should be looking at a more collaborative approach in terms of really doing this interfacing in a seamless manner without wasting so much of money, time? Of course, I'm talking against myself as a lawyer. This is business for me. But then from an industry perspective, do you really believe that time has come that as airline industry, you start looking at it in a different light?
Yeah. So you're absolutely right. You know, I have lived through a lot of it myself, from doing litigation and spending, I don't know how much on just trying to fight the ERA, and the airport operator gets involved. And so I have seen, so forget what it will be for Akasa, right? And I can tell you upfront that there's a complete collaborative approach that has been taken in this airline, right? As we start, it is being seen as partners in it together. That's the only way to achieve it, right? So you have many new players, as you know, in the airport space itself. You have many more private players in the market. All of them are very open to have a very, very collaborative conversation. That itself is extremely helpful as we start. But this is talking about an airline that's starting. Our approach will be very collaborative. We've got that kind of collaboration already when we speak to the airport operators. But that said, let me tell you, even in my past avatar, which is not very old, and the fact that I was with another airline, I had seen the change in approach in the airlines itself, who've been doing business with airport operators for the last 12, 13 years. And why did that change come? I think that change was driven with the fact that, am I going to be litigating against people who should be on the same side? If you don't have the infrastructure, you're not going to get the parking slot. You're not going to be able to fly, as you said, these 50, 60 flights in and out of various airports. Of course, we're talking about 50, 60. I was in an airline which had 1,500 flights a day. So if you didn't collaborate with them, one fine day, it's not going to make commercial sense for either, not for us, not for the airport operator. So I saw a big change and big shift in the last couple of years, even in airlines that have been in existence for a long period of time. The whole approach was, let's do business together. And that's become so much easier in the sense of this whole change of even getting some of the private players in, because they're also commercially driven to do this. They're not doing this because guess what? I want to see my name in an airport. Lots of people like that too. But the fact is, if it doesn't make commercial sense for them, they're not going to put in the investment time, money in it either. So given that it's for both people, it's commercially driven, I've seen a huge shift in the fact that this is a collaborative effort across the country. It can't be just one airport. It can't be just the major airports. I think we have to see it across the country in tier 2, tier 3 airports. And I can tell you, Atul, that I'm feeling the sense that it's very collaborative. And that's what we've been definitely seeing, at least at Akasa. Maybe we're new and everybody is, sort of ready to have a conversation. But I do have to say that it's not only something that I've seen here in the last 3 months. I also saw the shift in an airline before this. So.